And greetings and welcome back to another of my Perspectives chats. I've just had some thoughts from the what I've picked up from the news this morning, and I'm see if I can pull some threads together over this. And it's the theme of unidentified specters, as I call them. Now, there's been in the news since yesterday and from this morning, and I'm recording this on Sunday the 12th of February. I'm not sure which date it will go out, probably the end of the week, so a few days later. So any observant people who are scanning the propaganda out there and the programming will notice that recently the US said that they had shot down an unidentified object drifting over Alaska. Now, I'm not talking about the balloon situation. That's another that's another programming operation that was last week's news. It's all happening. But this is an unidentified object, which is very strange that they would come out and actually say they shot down an unidentified object over Alaska. And then there's news that apparently, it said some pilots had claimed that the unidentified object over Alaska had interfered with their sensors on their planes. Some pilots also claimed to have seen no identifiable propulsion on the object and could not explain how it was staying in the air despite the object cruising at an altitude of 40,000 feet. I'm reading from a news channel called the Inside Paper. And then just, of course, this morning, there was news that an unidentified object had been shot down over Canada. Again, very strange. Some reports claim that it was a metallic balloon-like object. Sounds like we're going back to the old weather balloons excuse. And another report saying that there potentially could be something over Montana, a strange object. The news in alert, radar anomaly detected, but no object found yet over Montana. All getting very strange. And then this news came in just half an hour ago from Inside Paper. Breaking news: China detects an unidentified flying object in waters near the coastal city of Rizal and preparing to shoot it down. Chinese media Global Times reports. All very strange. So it made me think of a couple of things, because one of the chapters in my upcoming book, The Inversion, which is coming out later this year, and the chapters is called Unidentified Specters, Spiritual Control Mechanisms as Trauma. And this is the idea that certain unidentified specters are actually used as a control mechanism, a programming. And we have to be careful about all these revelations. And I have a quote here from perhaps one of the most famous investigators of this field, Jacques Vallée, who many of you will be probably familiar with. Jacques Vallée was also the character that was role modeled by Steven Spielberg on his film Close Encounters of the Third Kind as the French scientist. Jacques Vallée has been studying this for decades, and one of his conclusions he came to, and I'll read it, I've quoted it. Jacques Vallée stated, he says, "I propose the hypothesis that there is a control system for human consciousness. Human life is ruled by imagination and myth. These obey strict laws, and they too are governed by control systems. What could paranormal phenomena control? I suggest that it is human belief that is being controlled and conditioned." And that's by Jacques Vallée, and comes from his book called The Invisible College, what a group of scientists has discovered about UFO influences on the human race. So he thinks that there's a control mechanism happening here. And I think it's very dangerous when you have these pronouncements and already in such a murky field as this unidentified area, unidentified objects, because this has been deliberately a programming area whereby myths are put out, and then of course they're quickly kind of shot down, literally, by claiming, oh no, it was a weather balloon or it's some other anomaly which we can explain. And then they kind of completely dismantle the myths, saying it's all rubbish. And then later on, especially in the last few years, especially in the last couple of years, certain authorities like the Pentagon, sounds like pentagram, it's a magical spell, not far off. The Pentagon had then been releasing these videos of verifiable sightings of UFOs, or that's what they call them. Now they call them unidentified aerial objects. Another way of renaming is messing with the idea and trying to reprogram a program onto an old program. And so that's what's happening here. And so I see this as a kind of social spiritual engineering. We have to be very careful, because anything which is public released in the mainstream news is there for a very deliberate reason, and especially when they're playing with these motifs. And when I was writing about this, I talked about kind of dissonance and cognitive dissonance. And I'll just read a few lines from my chapter on this. Manipulated and or controlled events have the power to affect and influence both the conscious and the unconscious mind. This can be utilized to create a split between what we are told to believe through our conditioning and what may be experienced on the metaphysical realm. This discrepancy can serve to create a rift in the human psyche and to fragment our reality boxes. Paranormal phenomena can be utilized to create an ambiguity that then produces a state of deferred closure. That is, because the conditioned rational mind cannot create a closure, i.e., there is no ultimate solution, this creates a dissonance. This dissonance is further reinforced through the dissemination and circulation of many alternative answers that, whilst promising to satisfy, instead end up confusing the human mind by not allowing it to find a consistent view of reality. This produces a state of closure starvation that is likely to persuade a person to accept the next explanation that offers some closure relief. It is a procedure of mind programming and manipulation that is increasingly common within our inverted reality. And I go on to say that that what we may be observing in the UFO phenomena is a type of this cognitive dissonance. I go on to say that this form of exposure and then denial creates bouts of creates a subconscious contradiction that goes towards fixing an extreme form of cognitive dissonance within the public mindset. This ongoing inconsistency between the two beliefs, are they real, are they not, does not create a resolution, i.e. closure starvation, but rather solidifies the uncertainty and dissonance through these well-placed subliminal contradictions. And the UFO phenomena is being blended with psychic, paranormal and metaphysical aspects as a way to colonize and reprogram the metaphysical domain. So I talk about that a lot of these exposure of information, and then the kind of different excuses, and then the denial, and then the exposure again of a potential reality, messes with our belief sets and creates a kind of dissonance. And this is operational procedure for types of mind programming. And anyone who's read my book Hijacking Reality that I put out in 2021, that I've talked about what's been happening in the last couple of years, especially since 2020, is that there's been a mind programming operation going on globally. And for example, when we had the global lockdowns, we had literally billions of people in their ways of movement and ways of habits, ways of life, suddenly in a state of paralysis. Locked down in your homes, your way of life locked down, and then of course all these shocks being implemented. And this kind of way of sudden halting a person, the mental apparatus, and then feeding iterations of shocks at different stages but continual, is another way of mind programming procedures. And these procedures have been known for decades and experimented on by many global players and governments, of course. And now it's being fed out into the world stage. So we have to realize that we are within a programming environment. But that shouldn't be new to anybody, because our very belief systems is a programmed environment. And that's also because we have a certain perception set, a range of perception which is very limited. And then we know that if you look at the electromagnetic spectrum, then the band of visible light is a very, very thin sliver, something like 0.05% of the electromagnetic spectrum is a part of visible light that our perceptions have the ability to operate in. So anything outside of that scale is just unknown to us. We could literally have beings and other events occurring in this environment, but we wouldn't perceive them because they're outside of our spectrum of visibility. And then within that very thin sliver of perception set, we are then further conditioned to believe or accept a certain narrative within that perception set. So when we are born into a conditioned environment through our institutional systems, our education, our peers, our cultural institutions. They all give us certain ways of thinking about the world, which is at this stage of our development a very materialistic belief set. So we're told only to believe what you can see. What you don't see, anything which is metaphysical outside the range of perception, is just nonsense or cannot be proved. If you can't prove it, doesn't exist. A very rational, empirical viewpoint. So within the range of visible spectrum, we then are further reduced according to our belief sets and conditioned programming. So to believe that there is other life in the cosmos or other realities, multidimensional realities, we've been told is complete nonsense. And we know that, even the idea of a UFO, which again is a very highly conditioned word, any indication of that, people like, a lot of people, less now, but majority before, used to think you were just, silly tin foil hat conspiracy person believing these fringe theories, because by putting out this idea, they also included the element to ridicule it. Because if we believed that these shaky tin cans would fly over the cosmos and, hundreds of light years in a tin can to get here, you see, you include the elements of the deconstruction of it within the story itself. So the story contains its own time bomb, to basically deconstruct it. But of course, if you want to speak about other dimensionalities and how other forms, intelligences, other existences can come into our visible spectrum by shifting their frequency and shifting their dimensional state, then of course you're speaking on a completely different level there. So they don't have to travel in tin cans across the physical universe, they can materialize in our dimension. So these things are known by the authorities, but they don't want to obviously go in that direction. And we've also been deconditioned, or conditioned rather, not to believe in our mental powers and abilities. At the same time where governments are developing these or researching these powers. A little bit of liquid there. And for example, again, I will just read a bit from the People of the Secret, which I mentioned in a previous video. And there's a bit here where they're talking about these powers, these mental powers, and how the governments have been working on them. And it's just talking about here how it's known, of course, in Russia, in the 60s, Russia and Americans very heavily into parapsychology experiments. And the Russia in the 60s had two parapsychological research centers, one in Moscow under Professor Azrajan, and at Leningrad, that time called Leningrad, under Professor Vasilev. And in an interview in the Daily Express in England on 21st of January 1963 with Professor Azrajan, he stated that the Russians had declared that they consider telepathy a proven fact. And the suggested mechanism is that brain radiation, having the same speed as light, emanates from the agent and triggers off nervous discharges in the brain of the subject, which can be rectified to give the image originally transmitted. Professor Vasilev, working in Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, is reported to have succeeded in establishing telepathic communication between Leningrad and the Black Sea. So way back in the 60s, this was known and proven. So you must think, what programming abilities do they have decades later? And in fact, I happen to have a copy of Professor Vasilev's book, which was published in 1965, and this is an original 1965 edition, and it's called Mysterious Phenomena of the Human Psyche. So imagine what he was able to publish and what he was not able to publish. And anyone interested in this, if you can't get hold of Vasilev's book, a more popularized book was released called Psychic Discoveries, The Iron Curtain Lifted. It was originally published in 1971, I think, or 1971 originally published. And I have suspicion that the original title was Psychic Discoveries Beyond the Iron Curtain. But of course, this is what I have is a reprint from 1997. Of course, I think they've retitled it Psychic Discoveries, The Iron Curtain Lifted, by Sheila Ostrander and Lynn Schroeder. So these talk about these experiments on programming, altering the human brain, and also working on notions of mental transference communication, what we know as telepathy. And interestingly, again, going back to the People of the Secret, they noted that telepathy, because it's an innate ability of the human race, may not always be wise to be used by people not suited to use it. And one thing said here is that there are certain groups of people who are let's say, looking after human interests for the betterment. And they say that this group who are able to use telepathy and have used it for centuries, in fact, they claim that their telepathy is actually used to induce skepticism about the possibility of telepathy in the minds of people who might misuse it if they could develop it. It is also used to motivate people towards useless and futile telepathic and other psychic or parapsychological efforts in order to divert them from premature discoveries in the field of esotericism. It also says that telepathy is within the range of existing human mental powers, but for reasons connected with the overall evolutionary situation of mankind, it is vital that this should not be realized at the present time or indeed within the foreseeable future. So what this is saying is that there are those more, let's say, developed people who are making sure that telepathy is not adequately misused or developed by unwise people or unwise groups such as the government, and they make sure that either certain people or groups of people are dissuaded from the functionality or ability of telepathy, and also certain experiments are deliberately sabotaged using telepathy to sabotage other psychic experiments because the results would not be beneficial to those people doing the experiments, perhaps meaning governments and black projects. So if we can bear this in mind, that all this is going on and has been going on for, let's say, at least half a century, publicly known, then we have to realize that a lot of knowledge of manipulation of human cognition that has been gathered for decades and is being worked on consistently, at least for 50 years or more. These were from, the Russians, for example. Vasilev was working in the 60s, so we talk about 60 years. A lot of the information gathered would then be utilized externally to also have programming, brain manipulation and mind programming on the public mass scale. So we need to bear that in mind when we're getting all this information coming through about this strange psychic phenomena, this strange aerial phenomena, which is obviously can create cognitive dissonance in some people, and the information is being used specifically in a way that would sit on the top of already installed programs within the human psyche that have been, lying there most of our lives. So what we need to do, I think, is not rush into any conclusions, but to understand that we are amidst a psychic environment, a mental environment that is highly compromised and is being deliberately manipulated by aspects of social engineering. And I think it's telling to go back to the Jacques Vallée quote that I started with. And this guy, after decades of research into paranormal and UFO phenomena, would come to the conclusion that there is a control system for human consciousness. And he suggests that human belief is being controlled and conditioned. So bearing that in mind, maybe we can have awareness as a first step to freeing ourselves from the chains of conditioning. So a few thoughts that I've tried to weave together. I hope it's been coherent enough and doesn't create any cognitive dissonance in any listeners to this video, because as you know, that's not my intention. Thanks for listening, and stay astute, stay alert, and stay balanced. As always, until next time, cheers.